think you just brought in another angle, civil society. We thought because the way and manner with which they go about pursuing any kind of agenda, we thought by now they should have actually started using it. As Chamberlain rightly started, he said some people already would want to call this the media law, thinking that it was only for the media organizations for them to use to really get information. But the way you just highlighted it means, well, everyone and anyone can actually use that act to get what you really want to find out. But going back to the opposition and those in government, because from the report we just played, it looks like everyone feels that it's something to check government of the day. Can the government of the day, vice versa, also use the same law to check maybe the opposition?
Oh yes, oh yes. By the way, I want to quickly go back to the question about whether this is something that concerns the media alone. Nothing can be more misleading. The media has a very fundamental symbiotic relationship with society. The media generates content that is consumed by society, and so if the media does not do this kind of investigative work, it means the society is poorer for it. People are less informed. And so as a consequence of the failure of the media, the people become less and less informed. And if the people are less informed, they fail in their citizenship responsibilities. Remember what J.F. Kennedy said in the 60s in the U.S. He said the highest office in the land is the office of citizen, meaning that we have a responsibility not simply to be voting mechanically every 4 years, but to hold those people to account. Every sector of society, not just those in government or those in opposition. If you are a university lecturer, you can't possibly be demanding money for scores. And students themselves have a responsibility to know how they've been assessed. So the whole point of this kind of legislation is that it basically demystifies public life, not just those who hold political offices, but anybody who is active in the public domain and has a responsibility to act accountably and responsibly towards the public. So we have a very fundamentally important piece of legislation, but as I said, if you don't activate it, we can't expect government officials to hold themselves to account. The president, for instance, has some kind of performance evaluation system, for cabinet ministers. But these cabinet ministers are ultimately accountable to the people. The president was elected by Nigerians, but by electing him, we empowered him to also appoint those who will work for him. But in the last analysis, in the whole of the value chain of accountability, they are ultimately accountable to the people. But how do you account to the people if the people themselves do not have the awareness that you need to account to them? So I suspect that because of the decades of military rule, we've become desensitized to the questions of accountability, transparency, and good governance. So what we need to do then is for all sectors of society, the media, civil society organizations, labor interest groups such as the NBA, all sectors of society must become stakeholders in this act and activate it in order to make sure that those who occupy public spaces are held accountable. I think that's the organizing logic of the law itself.
You try to, explain the lethargy that you've seen as, maybe many years of military rule. Do you also think that skepticism, the fact that what we do most times is talk about many issues, and it seems nothing is done about even the issues that are spoken up about, and that just creates another despair. If I get the information I need and I put it out there, what next? Do you think that sense that nothing will come of it also discourages people?
Yes, it does. You see, you've made a very important point. If you've had a stretch of time of dysfunctionality, lack of accountability, and that was why I went back to the question of military rule. By its very nature, military governments were unaccountable. And so if you've had this stretch of administration of an experience of unaccountability, the tendency is for people to become not just skeptical but cynical of institutions. No question about that. But you see, on the flip side, you can't be hostages of cynicism. You can't be hostages of skepticism. The judicial process, for instance, is very flawed in this country. And so sometimes if you demand certain information from government offices or government officials and they don't provide those information as required by the FOI Act, you need to contest this intransigence on the part of government officials in the courts. And I know, from what Makwe has said, that because of this tradition of lack of accountability, a certain lethargy or skepticism sets in. But then we don't have any alternative. We can't be hostages to cynicism or skepticism. So we must test the system and see whether this is something we can correct. I agree that we have a very dysfunctional institution, and civil society is fragmentary and weak, and most of them do not have any particular ideological purpose. But this is part of the kind of evolution that we experience as we form a nation. But that if we have a legislation such as this, I think we have a responsibility, not that of government, because government is supposed to be the institution to be held to account. So you can't expect them to be as enthusiastic as the citizens who ought to hold government to account. This is entirely our responsibility, and we can't afford to abdicate the responsibility.
So one should expect to perhaps ultimately test it in court, because government will not be immediately forthcoming with some of these
Yes,
things.
and if we test it in court and we see instances of judicial malpractice by judicial officers, it becomes a scandal which the media can also take up as part of its larger battle against this kind of institutional malfeasance.
What role do you see culture play in all of this, in terms of either impeding or perhaps facilitating usage of this bill? Because by culture I mean where even in tertiary institutions,
yes,
where you question professors concerning certain things and they tell you, no, I'm the dean of this faculty, I've taken that decision and that's it. They don't expect anything further to come from there.
Yeah.
A culture wherein they say you're not expected to ask your elders certain questions, and
yes,
so some of those things, do you think there are issues?
Oh yes, there are issues, and it's a good thing that you raise this point, because you see, sociologically speaking, the culture of a people is the way of life of the people, and part of our way of life, our political way of life in Nigeria, is that we've been oppressed for so long. We do not have the culture of holding people to account. We also culturally have a gerontocratic system where there is so much unqualified respect for elders and people who occupy positions of authority, and so we do not have that kind of systemic practice of holding elders even in communities to account. But the good thing about culture is that it is constantly in a state of flux. It's always changing and dynamic. So even if this is our practice now, we also have the power to change the culture itself. We are not slaves to our culture. We are agents of culture, and we want to change the culture. It's entirely up to us. And my suggestion is that the government has agencies such as the National Orientation Agency, and the key mandate of that agency is to engage in national orientation. In this case, what we need is a massive national reorientation from this culture of lethargy, this culture of skepticism and cynicism about government and its activities and institutions, to a culture of holding people to account. So until we do that, we can't expect to see the kind of changes we always want to see.